Welcome to Hearthside Lore. The dwarves have been waging war for over 4,000 years. Theirs is a sorrowful tale of a once great empire which has slowly been worn down by the constant struggle against goblins, skaven, and other foul races. Over the course of many centuries, they have fought with a grim determination to defend their realm. It is a bitter struggle against a foe whose numbers never seem to dwindle, and many of their magnificent holds have fallen into the hands of their enemies. Still they fight on, for such is the courage and resolve of these brave warriors, that one day they truly believe that their empire will be great again. The Dwarf Throng. Dwarf Warriors. Thorgrim Redmane cast an eye over the crowd, ignoring the snores of the weak-headed who had already succumbed to the ale. "Course," he declared to those still conscious, "the real test of a dwarf's mettle is in battle. Like as not, some of you young'uns have been called up by the thanes to fight, like old dwarfs are sworn to do. Aye, that's a sight and a half, seeing the ranks of the hold arrayed for war, their fine armor and well-forged weapons gleaming in the lamplight." He sighed deeply at the thought before taking another tremendous gulp of beer from the horn in his calloused hand. "Still, back in the old days, there were armies the likes of which you've never seen, and even the short-beards like you softens were ardent warriors. Utterly loyal they was, not come and go as you please like some folk I could mention. Sturdy fighters, respectful of their thanes and king, sworn to lay down their lives in defense of the old, staunch in the face of the greatest dangers, stand fast against anything they would. Nary a dragon or a great demon would cause them to raise an eyebrow, or perish the cur who thought of saving his own life before protecting his kinsman." Redmane downed the remainder of his ale and wiped the froth from his beard on his sleeve. "Like a well-crafted mail-shirt a dwarf army is. Each warrior an iron-hard link, knitted together by duty, respect, and loyalty. And like a mail shirt, never a blow shall pass them, as long as all the links remain strong." He looked accusingly at the assembled youngsters. "No weak links here, I hope?" There was a cry of disapproval, and proclamations of courage rang from the low rafters of the tavern, and set the shields on the wall to shaking. "That's what I thought." Dwarfs live in family units called clans. In times of war, these clans muster together any dwarves old enough to fight, and form together into regiments. The warriors of these regiments are expected to maintain their own armor and weapons, which are often ancient family heirlooms, which have been handed down through the generations, and presented to the dwarf when he comes of age. Slayers. Leaning back in his chair, the old dwarf cleared his throat with a deep cough. "Back before you were lusty twinkles in your father's eye, I was fighting goblins at the shores of the Blackwater Pool. A warrior at the young age of 100. I was proud to be fighting with the High King and his kin. Oh, those were the days when goblins were real goblins, not like the skinny green wretches you get nowadays." Redmane pulled a pipe from his pocket, handing it to one of his audience to fill. "Now, as I was saying, before the High King was treacherously pulled to his sad demise over the icy falls, I was lucky enough to meet a slayer bearing the name Gareth Ungrim. It was from him that I learned of the tale of the very first slayer. Gudrun was his name, and he was best friend to King Scory Morgimson. The pair had grown up together as beardlings, and fought side by side in many a battle. That having been said, you can imagine the honor that he felt when the king asked him to protect his only son, Fergal. as he attempted to infiltrate the lower halls of Karak Azgal. Swearing an oath to his king, Gudrun followed Fergal on his mission when the party was ambushed by a band of night goblins, accompanied by a huge troll. Gudrun fought valiantly to save his prince's life. It said that over 60 of the vile grubby lay at his feet, but still they came, until a lucky blow struck Gudrun unconscious. As blackness enveloped his eyes, he saw Fergal being carried away by the troll. The small crowd that had gathered around Thorgrim sat in silence, enraptured by his tale. When he awoke, he found himself alone. The goblins had left him for dead, although they had stolen his hammer, and even rubbed the very boots from his feet. Gudrun tracked the troll, treading barefoot down through the dark depths of Karak Azgal until he found its lair. Upon discovering the slain, mutilated body of the dwarf prince, such was Gudrun's rage that he took the dead prince's rune axe and beheaded the vile troll with a single blow. Gudrun's shame upon failing to protect his ward was so deep that he knew he could never return to Karaz Karak and face the king. Now before his murder, Prince Fergal sported a deep, fiery red beard that was the envy of every dwarf this side of the world's edge mountains. In his grief, Gudrun dyed his own hair orange, in respect to the fallen prince. Unable to fulfill his oath to his king, Gudrun wandered the mountains, seeking death as a release from his sorrow. He spent the remainder of his years hunting down and slaying every troll that he could find. To this day, dwarfs unable to fulfill an oath still dye their hair bright orange and wield an axe in respect of Gudrun and Fergal. As for Gudrun, no one knows of his fate, but none shall forget his name. Old Redmane sucked on the large pipe which had been filled and lit for him.
Call this pipe weed.
He coughed out a great billow of musky-smelling smoke. I've smoked hay that tasted bitter. Dwarves are very proud individuals, and do not cope well with failure or personal loss. When a tragedy occurs, a dwarf may be driven to take the oath of the slayer. He will break all ties with his hold and his clan, and seek death by hunting down and fighting a monstrous beast. Many achieve their wish to die at the hands of a foul creature, but some survive to fight more beasts until the day they meet their final destiny. Runesmiths.
Well, if you ask me, it's all that dabbling with wizards and their like that has all them other races in such a poor state.
Redmane continued, lugging a keg of ale from the bar and thudding it down on the table in front of him.
No true dwarf has truck with that kind of wild magic. Oh no. In the olden days, our ancestors realized the perils of dabbling with the forces of magic in its raw form, and they knew best. Runes they made. Powerful runes to capture the magic, not let it float about all willy-nilly where it could do no end of harm. Everything had runes on 'em in them days, not like now when there's something rare and special. Even had me a rune lamp once, and a rune cloak. But now there isn't a runesmith who can make 'em.
The old hammerer prized the top of the beer keg and dipped his drinking horn into the foamy, lumpy liquid within.
The runesmiths, you see, they's a rare breed now, and getting rarer. And the magic, that's going too. Only the Runelords, the venerable ones with a good 500 years under their belt, only they can try to make really powerful runes these days. Was a time when an apprentice would be forging them types of runes, but not nowadays. I remember great-great-great-uncle Snardy had a rune axe that could take the top off a mountain, if he had a mind to do it, which he didn't, 'cause attacking mountains is something that only a daft manling would do. Still, them Runelords have got their anvils of doom. Keep them in good shape still. Lug one of them up to the battle and you'll see what good old-fashioned rune lore was like. Not like the cantrips and petty nonsense you'll get today.
Runesmiths are ancient and powerful individuals, and as such are accorded a great status within their stronghold. It takes hundreds of years for an apprentice to master the skills necessary to forge a rune. They uphold family traditions of working metal and magic into the mighty runes of power. The Anvil of Doom. The Anvils of Doom are ancient devices forged with great skill by the runesmiths of old in the bowels of Thunder Mountain. Using the energy of the volcano's heart, Kurgaz, the most skilled of the Old Ones, melted Gromril to forge the anvils. As they cooled, Kurgaz beat the rune of sorcery onto each gleaming anvil. No one knows how many anvils were forged before the secret of the rune of sorcery was lost. The Dwarf Book of Grudges records how an evil dragon attacked Thunder Mountain and slew the old runesmith in a mighty battle which rent the mountain apart. During the devastation, the forges of Thunder Mountain were destroyed, and many runesmiths slain. In present times, the Anvils of Doom are ancient and valuable heirlooms, and the dwarfs value them more highly than any of their other possessions. Runesmiths use the Anvils of Doom for making magic items. Most anvils are owned by the various strongholds or by the guilds, and the runesmiths make use of these when they need to. A few anvils are owned by runesmiths, but these tend to be the sedentary runesmiths who reside in the halls of Karaz and the weapon shops of Karak Azgal. The anvils are objects of great power, and in times of extreme need, a runesmith can unleash fire and lightning upon his foes. With a mighty blow of his hammer, the runesmith can release the anvil's power. Lightning strikes as mighty energies unfurl, the sky darkens with brooding energy, and clouds of multicolored magic swirl and sparkle in the air. A Runelord, one of the oldest and most revered runesmiths, may bring an anvil to battle. The dwarf army can use the anvil to draw energy from the winds of magic, the nebulous source of magic power that flows over the battlefield. Just as wizards draw upon the winds of magic to cast their spells, the anvil absorbs magical energies to power the runes engraved upon it. Thunderers.
Now don't get me wrong. I'd rather be on the right end of a handgun than the wrong end. But what's wrong with proper old-fashioned crossbows?
The old hammerer was mumbling to himself as much as talking to the dwarves around him.
I mean, it makes an awful stink for Grungy's sake, and smoke everywhere. Stings your eye, something rotten it does. Still, they're better than those contraptions the manlings carve out these days. At least you can hit something at 50 paces. Crossbows have been around for thousands of years. But you youngsters have your heads turned by the latest whiz-bang to come out of the Engineers Guild. Progress, they calls it. Fixing what isn't broken, I've half a mind to say.
Some clans are rich enough to purchase handguns from the Engineers Guild. Extremely proud of these weapons, they go to great lengths to maintain them. Dwarf handguns are exceptional works of craftsmanship, and are more accurate than the shoddy constructions of the Empire. Rangers.
That's a well-made crossbow,
exclaimed Redmane, turning the weapon over in his hands and examining it carefully.
Hunting design, if I'm not mistaken. You practicing to be a ranger, lad?
He asked the owner, who nodded slightly, unsure whether this would meet the old dwarf's approval or not.
Something odd about a dwarf who likes being up on the surface all day, hunting and such. In the olden days, we wouldn't have gone above ground for more than an hour unless we had to. All that sun and air is bad for your health, you know. And there's plenty of ranger gone missing, never to return. Of course, some say they got sun-touched and wandered off. Others think the trolls and orcs got them. Who am I to say?
The would-be ranger shrugged and made a half-hearted attempt to retrieve his crossbow, but it was drawn just out of reach as Redmane turned towards the bar.
In the old days, we didn't need rangers to tell us what was happening. We'd have messengers running around the underway from hold to hold, telling folks what was going on, if the orcs was on the move or whatever. Sneaking about in the rocks and woods, spying and watching, that sounds like something an elf would do. No offense to you, lad. I guess we needs to know what's going on, and who's going where and whatnot. But I don't envy having to spend all that time in the open air. It'll stunt your beard, so it will.
Rangers watch over the mountain passes that snake their way through the dwarf realms. They keep watch for approaching danger, and hunt down goblins and orcs. When they spot an approaching army, they will send signals to the watch posts of the stronghold. And, once their Karak has been warned, they will gather together at an elected meeting place. Once all their numbers have arrived, they get into battle formation and hound the invading army. Miners. As he wandered back to the tavern's bar, Redmane's eye fell upon a pile of shovels and picks carefully piled up at the end of the counter.
"Some of you youngins work down in the mines?"
he asked, answered with a few cautious nods from the young dwarves who were already slouched drunkenly at the main trestle.
"Good!"
he boomed, a wide grin splitting his face.
"Mining, that's a proper dwarf job. None of this messing about with grungy knows what. Just good honest stone and metal. That's a miner's work. Still, the mines aren't what they used to be,"
he continued, followed by the sound of the other dwarfs' heads thudding to the table.
"There was a time when you couldn't dig for more than a few inches without finding a nugget of gold or a seam of iron ore. Not like the mountains these days. They've swallowed it all up, so you have to grub for weeks just to find a bit of dull copper. And no one these days knows the tunnels like the old mine masters used to. Could go anywhere for a month without ever setting foot in the daylight, as it should be. A few of the old-timers, proper miners to my mind, know the secret ins and outs of the caverns around abouts, but was a time when you could ask a miner in Zufbar about the digs in Karak Azgal and he could draw you a map from memory. Still, you lads know how to swing a pick, I trust, whether it's for a piece of gold or at a damned elf's head."
Dwarves have an insatiable thirst for gold, and construct deep shafts into the hearts of the mountains in their quest to acquire the valuable metal. They also mine for ores and gemstones, and are very skilled at digging tunnels at incredible speed. The networks of mines and tunnels run through every mountain range. In battle, they use their knowledge of the tunnels and mastery of the pickaxe with deadly intent. Hammerers. Thorgrim Redmane paused in his storytelling long enough for a young barmaid to bring him yet another tankard of beer. Pouring the contents of the vessel down his throat in a matter of seconds, he thanked the young dwarf with a curt nod. "How do you get to be a hammerer, sir, if it's not too presumptuous of me to ask?" Handing the empty tankard back to the serving girl, he motioned for her to fill it again.
"Through hard work, skill, and much practice. Like any good warrior would tell you, there ain't no shortcuts, only quick deaths."
The old dwarf's mood had become sullen and somber. Dwarfs never talk of battle lightly. For dwarves, battle was a necessary evil which had taken a heavy toll on their race after many years of long, protracted warfare.
"It's my kin that's been responsible for the hammerers being the bodyguard of the dwarf lords to this very day,"
a few of the younger dwarves murmured to themselves. Old Redmane was renowned for his outlandish tales, but this was an extravagant claim indeed. One look at the scowling face of the old dwarf was enough to shut them up.
"As I was saying, 'twas my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, no less than Cardin Redmane himself. In those days, he was working as a master craftsman in the forges of the gold mines of Gunbad.
King Morgrim Blackbeard had decided to pay the mines a visit to bolster morale after years of vicious fighting, as cruel fate would have it. 'Twas that same day that the accursed night goblins broke through the mine's walls. The king was at their mercy, for his small bodyguard were overwhelmed as hundreds of gibbering grubby poured into the mines. As the last of the king's bodyguard fell, Cadrin Redmane, seeing the desperate situation, took the hammer that he'd been using to work the gold and charged out of the forge to protect his liege. Seeing his brave act, the other smiths followed him. Grabbing their forge hammers, slowly they cleared an escape route out from the mines. Thorgrim by now had silenced the youngsters in the crowd. Every dwarf in the tavern was engrossed in the story. As a reward, the king presented Cadrin with a magnificent rune hammer. An over-enthusiastic young dwarf couldn't keep his excitement in check and spoke out of turn. Was that the same hammer that he threw into Blackwater to prevent it getting into orc hands? Thorgrim reached down to his belt and pulled out his own hammer. Intricately carved runes were inscribed upon it. Rainbows of color danced around the room as the light of the candles reflected through the perfect prisms of the multifaceted gem fixed into the metal. So legend would have you believe. The old dwarf slowly rose from his stool. Tucking his hammer back into his belt, he picked up an old, worn cloak and stepped out of the tavern. He turned to the door and gave one last piece of advice. One thing you'll learn as you grow older. Don't believe all that you hear. The hammerers are the king's personal guard, and so are accorded a high status within the stronghold. They are very skilled warriors, and are personally selected by the king himself. If a dwarf should prove himself courageous enough over the course of many battles, he may be selected to join the hammerers. Ironbreakers. Down in the mines, that can be dangerous work, Thorgrim expounded, waving a tankard as he strolled back into the tavern, heading straight for the bar. Not as dangerous as it used to be, mind, but that's why our ancestors formed the Ironbreakers. Head to foot in the best Gromrel armor. It'd be a brave goblin troll or rat man who faces an Ironbreaker and doesn't turn tail. And even if the roof caved in, not that a good proper dwarf roof would do that, but them goblin tunnels is shoddy work. 9 times out of 10, he'd climb out again, dust himself down, and get back to the fight. Not like you young whelps. The Ironbreakers guard the deep abandoned tunnels from the numerous dark creatures that would otherwise invade the hold. They spend much of their time below ground in the deepest, least visited parts of the stronghold. Because of the extreme danger of their duty, they wear fine suits of Gromrel armor to protect themselves. Long beards. The old hammerer stroked a hand through his beard. Course, if I weren't a hammerer, I'd be with the Longbeards these days, he announced to the occupants of the smoky tavern. When you've got proper beards, you might understand what a bit of Nollingrom means, what it's like to respect a dwarf for the fullness of his beard. This beard here says I'm old, and that means I know best, and you knows that too. So that's why you're going to listen to my advice. Then you can grow up and be proper dwarves and pass on your advice to the next generation. Remember, a dwarf's only as big as his beard. Dwarves are taught from an early age to respect their elders, and the oldest dwarves in the stronghold are accorded the greatest respect. Their beards must stretch down to the floor before they are given the prestigious title of Longbeard. The ceremony that follows when a dwarf finally joins this elite caste is a great occasion. Many a tavern has been drunk dry in the ensuing feast. Engineers Guild. If somebody would care to refresh my palate, then perhaps I can continue. Old Redbeard, as he was more commonly known amongst the dwarfs that frequented the Black Dragon Tavern, had emptied yet another keg of Bugman's ale. Unlike many of the younger dwarves who were currently collapsed asleep on the tables, he was showing little if any sign of intoxication. His red, bulbous nose was a clear indicator that he was a seasoned veteran to drink.
Back when I were a lad, any elder recounting tales of the past would have filled this bar twice over with people, all eager to hear his words of wisdom to pass down to their children.
Thorgrim took the freshly filled tankard off the barman, thanking him politely.
Still, what with all those newfangled contraptions such as likes of gyrocopters and flame copters, it's hardly surprising that your generation has the attention span of a troll. I remember my great-grandfather telling me about the day the engineers discovered black powder. Now, I'm not one to belittle the Engineers Guild, even if they are a bunch of dangerous, insane lunatics, but there are dwarves amongst them that'll have you believe that the invention of black powder was quite intentional.
Thorgrim chuckled to himself.
You try telling that to the poor dwarves who found themselves blown straight up to the cavern roof. It took them days to clear up the mess. There's still a dent or two in the ceiling. So they say.
A few of the crowd that had gathered burst out in laughter.
Still, for all their bumbling about, they certainly know how to make good cannons. You'll rarely see a dwarf cannon blow up. Not like those shoddy, cheap, oversized pop guns that the men of the Empire are so proud of. Great cannons! Ha!
Thorgrim spat his contempt.
The only thing great about them is that 'twere a dwarf who invented them. Dwarf cannons are built to last. We won't even consider taking one to battles unless it's over 500 years old. Unless the engineer who built it has a beard down past his boots, the cannon ain't worth the iron it's forged from.
You see, an engineer has to be that old to be able to help the runesmith inscribe the correct runes.
Still, I reckon we'll live to regret the day we gave the secret of black powder to the manlings. It won't be long before it's turned against its creators.
The audience murmured in general agreement with old Redmayne.
Mind you, I still can't see them becoming too popular. There ain't naught a cannon can do but a determined dwarf with a hammer can't achieve. The Engineers Guild, they call themselves.
Redmayne snorted.
Messing about with black powder and whatnots is what I call it. Still, them engineers can cast a good cannon, and they know how they work like no one else. You want to land a shot on a goblin a mile away, ask an engineer to lay the gun for you. And he'll ask you which eye you want to hit.
If a dwarf shows a particular aptitude with machinery, he may be granted an apprenticeship with the Engineers Guild, which maintains the numerous working devices of the dwarves. Guild members spend much of their time repairing broken components and cursing the shoddy work of the engineer who first constructed it. They are also responsible for inventing new devices. If the guild thinks a concept is worthy enough, it will fund the dwarf with all the equipment, materials, and help needed. Most inventions never quite take off, but others, such as the legendary gyrocopter, quite literally do. Flame cannon.
Now something half decent that the engineers have given us, though still a new gizmo in anyone's books, is the flame cannon.
Thorgrim informed his dazed audience.
One of them tried to explain to me how it works once. He said a volatile concoction of hot oil and molten tar is mixed in the barrel of the flame cannon. He told me air is pumped into the barrel until the pressure inside is very great, and the barrel is almost ready to burst. At precisely the right moment, the crew place a burning oily wad into the nozzle and release the pressure inside. The mixture catches fire as it spurts from the barrel, and burning oil arcs into the air towards the enemy ranks. With a bit of luck, the flaming oil lands right in the middle of the enemy, spraying fire and boiling tar over the target. Well, that's how they say. To me it goes whoosh. There's a huge blast of flame. Then the enemy goes running off with smoke trailing from him.
The flame cannon is a deadly weapon capable of inflicting extreme damage at short ranges. It is a brave dwarf who volunteers to crew this extraordinary cannon, as there is a strong chance that when the flammable concoction is set alight, the cannon will instantaneously explode. Dwarf organ gun.
There was this engineer, only a few hundred years ago, Loki Snarson, who had this real ear for music.
Redmane the Hammerer told the patrons of the tavern.
He had this idea of some kind of big instrument that used pressure and pipes to make different noises. Anyways, he called it an organ, and it sounded terrible. However, another engineer, Durin Kurgensen, had an idea and took all those pipes, laid them flat, and made a big multi-barreled cannon out of them. The organ gun, he called it, and a few other engineers liked it so much they copied it.
He took a swig of ale to clear his throat.
Still, them pipes weren't big enough for cannonballs. But then putting 5 of them together means you can fire all the barrels at the same time. And mighty devastating it is if it hits. Not like a proper cannon that you can train and elevate and actually aim proper. But you gets lucky every once in a while, and you'll see chariots disappear into firewood, and minotaurs spattered across the grass.
One of the engineers' guild's stranger creations, the organ gun has been known to decimate entire regiments that have been foolish enough to stand before it. Whilst not as powerful as a cannon, in the right hands, it can prove just as effective. Gyrocopter.
When the underway started cracking up under all the earthquakes and such, the engineers found another way to get messages from one hold to the next,
Thorgrim explained, resting his tankard on the head of a dwarf who had flopped across the table next to him.
Couldn't go underground, and there was orcs and trolls and the like swarming everywhere, so you couldn't go across ground. Some bright spark decided that you could go overground, and built the gyrocopter. It's got big spinny blades powered by a steam engine. Height of making small engine technology, one engineer told me. And it can take off from a small place, so it can buzz about the mountaintops with nary a worry about what's below.
He imitated a swooping gyrocopter with his free hand, flitting across the table and resting on the tobacco pouch of a dwarf sitting across from him, before returning with its cargo to his pipe.
Then some dwarf lord, Thane Orgry, I reckons, thought about putting a little cannon on one. The pilot, as they call the fool who flies the contraption, must be mad as a halfling to go up there if you asks me. A dwarf should have his feet on the ground, or more preferably, 100 feet below it. But they're nippy little beggars, I can tell you, and useful for getting behind the enemy and giving them a good wallop in the backside with that rapid-firing gun.
The brave, and some would say insane pilots of these crazy contraptions, gather together in their own distinct regiments. Due to the high costs, maintenance of the machines comes from the royal treasury, and so this elite unit are known as the King's Flying Corps. The Dwarf Armory. Dwarves are renowned across the old world as superb artisans and craftsmen, and were the first to discover black powder weapons. Even the arrogant elves once purchased dwarf-forged items. Each apprentice smith and artisan must undergo decades of training before he can be called a true craftsman. And only those with a century or more of experience under their belt would claim to be experts. Coupled with this immense skill is a dwarf's unbending sense of pride and honor. It is claimed that it is physically impossible for a dwarf to do a shoddy job. They simply cannot bring themselves to cut corners or make compromises in quality. This ensures that any weapon that leaves the forges is of the highest quality, every detail perfected, every nut, bolt, and nail lovingly crafted with individual care and scrupulous attention. Gromrill armor. Armor made from the metal known as Gromrill is the toughest and most sturdy in the known world, known variously as meteoric iron, silverstone, and hammer-wrought armor. Gromrill armor is limited to wealthy dwarves and the elite ironbreakers. Dwarf handguns. The handguns of the dwarf thunderers, called dragon belchers by the more superstitious goblin tribes, feature many improvements over the crude devices used by other races. These features include rifled barrels, finer powder grain, and more reliable firing mechanisms. Dwarf runes. Magic pervades the Warhammer world and permeates all things. It flows into the material realm from beyond the chaos wastes as an ever-shifting flux of energy. This energy can be perceived and used by the races of the Warhammer world. Some races, such as elves and men, can use magic to cast terrifying and destructive spells. Dwarves, on the other hand, are extremely resistant to magic and its influence, neither perceiving its presence nor feeling its effects. Dwarves have learned to use the power of magic in a different way, by incorporating it into magic items such as hammers, axes, and armor. The dwarves are the greatest and most successful of all races when it comes to making magic items. Indeed, many of the most powerful magic weapons used by elves and men were made by the dwarves using their unique skills. A dwarf who makes magic items is called a runesmith. As dwarves have no direct equivalent to a human wizard, he is a very important individual. The runesmiths are an ancient guild of craftsmen, and for thousands of years they have preserved the secrets of how to forge magic runes, and how to make weapons, armor, and other items of incredible power. The dwarf language is written in runes, inscriptions specifically designed to be carved in stone or engraved in metal. Magic runes are different to ordinary runes in shape and detail, but much of what makes a rune magical is how and when it is engraved. Magic runes trap magical power. Their presence binds and holds magic, just as a nail holds together two pieces of timber. Most simple dwarf runes can trap weak amounts of magic if engraved in a special way, but magic runes can entrap much greater power. Such runes include the awesome master runes and certain secret runes, known only to runesmiths of the temples of Grungi, Grimnir, and Valea. Runic magic. A rune rite of forging. Seek the mountain's heart. Take it on third moon's last day. Stoke the furnace at midnight, when the ore glows red. Hammer it before dawn. 7 times bend the white-hot metal upon itself. 7 times sing the forging song. Quench in dragon's blood. Slake red-hot in Karak Azgal's quicksilver. Do this in Haki, the ancestor's name. Temper in Varn's water. Hone the blade upon a dragon's horn. On winter's 3rd moon, carve the slaying rune. Anoint with blood of troll, slain on Grungi's day. Bind the hilt with dragon's hide, with horn side inside. Haft the hilt with Azgal's gold, bind with azul metal. Mark the orc fang's pommel with Grimnir's sign. Make the naming rite with ale upon Valea's altar. The slaying of a troll by night will make the rune to glow for 1,000 years. Put your trust in stone and iron. Stone and iron have always been true friends of the dwarves. Dwarves of legend. The history of the dwarves is one of battle. They have been betrayed by their former allies, and their homes have been overrun by countless monsters from the depths. But in all this time, the dwarves have not given up hope. They are stubborn to a fault in their unwillingness to contemplate surrender, and even the loss of one of their ancestral holds is seen as only a temporary setback. Their golden age will come again, or so they believe. However, there are some of their number who stand out as exceptional, even amongst this race of valiant warriors. And as the dwarves never forget either a favor or a slight, we can recount a few of these tales here. Ungrim Ironfist, the Slayer King of Karak Azgal. The meaning of the unfortunate Ungrim's name, Oathbound, tells his story well, for he is bound by 2 oaths that he cannot reconcile. The first is his loyalty to the people he rules. The second is his inherited Slayer oath to seek a noble death, something he cannot honorably do whilst his people still need him. Gotrek Gurnishan and Felix Jaeger. Just as in the sagas of old, this mismatched pair of adventurers seem doomed to wander the world until the fate the gods have decreed for them is at hand. Legend has it that the man, Felix, a minor poet and general ne'er-do-well, fell in with the slayer Gotrek during an epic drinking binge. It is said that Felix made a vow to enshrine Gotrek's quest for a noble death in a poem, and that he would stay with him until his doom came to pass. It is an oath he has learned to consider a trifle hasty, as it has led him into the darkest and most lethal corners of the old world, and pitted them against the most heinous of foes. Gotrek, however, seems all but unkillable, and, as long as he breathes, Felix cannot find it in his honor to break his oath. Who knows which battlefields they will fight on next, or which monstrosity will finally be Gotrek's doom. High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer. With the blood of Grungi himself running in his royal veins, it is hardly surprising that Thorgrim is deeply concerned with the fate of his race. It is his concern that makes the Damazkron, the great book of grudges of the dwarves, his constant companion, whether it is resting beneath his pillow at night or accompanying him to one of his many battles atop the throne of power. Damazkron is never far from his side. Thorgrim rules from the heights of Karaz and ventures forth frequently to avenge one or other of the many wrongs he has studied in Damazkron. Even though the dwarves are reluctant to go to war and risk the lives of their diminishing number of warriors, the cause of vengeance is considered so just that they rally to Thorgrim with eagerness and follow him wherever he leads. Joseph Bugman, the most famed dwarf brewmaster of all time, his Bugman's XXXXXX is responsible for many a royal hangover, since the tranquility of his peaceful brewery was smashed by goblin raiders who destroyed the vats and killed or enslaved his workers. Bugman has sworn revenge, and now fights greenskins wherever he can. His small band of rangers are seldom noticed as they roam the Badlands in search of goblins to slaughter, and prisoners to rescue. But every now and again, they will turn up at a dwarf camp to offer their aid as the army readies for battle. Burlok Damnison, Engineer Guildmaster. Burlok has been an engineer for centuries, and although something of a rebel in his youth, the loss of his arm in an accident and a furious reprimand from his father showed Burlok the error of his ways. Now he is a staunch traditionalist and resists any thought of innovation in the Dwarf Engineers Guild. His missing arm has been replaced by a mechanical contrivance of his own devising, and over the many years since the accident, he has improved it so that it now works even better than his natural arm. Thorek Ironbrow, Dwarf Runelord, Master of the weapon shops of Karak Azgal.
Now, you young'uns might be thinking that naught as good as it used to be, grumbled Thorgrim Redmane, eyeing the gathered beardlings. Well, there's something in that, but it's not all bad. Take this here tavern.
He continued, including the whole of the smoky room with a wave of his hand.
Couple of 100 years ago, this was all rock.
His drunken audience admired the bar anew with bleary eyes.
And that's not all. There are even a few folk, like myself, who try to follow the old ways. Not many, but enough to give you young'uns all hope. Take old Ironbrow, for instance. You've all heard of him, haven't you?
Thorgrim glanced over the rim of his ale mug at the attentive dwarves, but didn't bother waiting for a reply.
Thorek's a dwarf of the old times. Karak Azgal's where he lives, and where he's master of the armories. Lucky lot to have him, too. He's got one of them anvils of doom that were made by Kurgaz, and he knows more of its secrets than most of those that have 'em. He's also not afraid to use the power in it, not like some so-called Runelords I could mention. Anyway, like I was saying, he's a proper old-fashioned dwarf with little time for them modern ideas on how to forge weapons and armor. Nor does he care what runes are fashionable this century or that. If it was good enough for our ancestors in the War of Vengeance, it's good enough for Thorek Ironbrow. I've heard him say as much himself, and I felt right proud to hear it. Now I can see what some of you are thinking. What about progress? Well, that's all nonsense. Anyone can tell you that's just muddle-headed elf thinking. After all, we're doing worse, not better. And what we really need is a return to the good old days, not some newfangled replacement for things that weren't broke. Thorek Ironbrow is a worthy role model for any of you that fancy yourselves as runesmiths. You could do a lot worse than trying to impress him with your skill and understanding of the old ways, though it'll be right hard. He demands the highest standards and expects nothing less than your total commitment. Can't afford to mess with the power of an anvil of doom if you're all half-hearted.
Thorgrim paused, a faraway look in his eyes.
When they were made, all the anvils could use the rune they're named for. But now I reckon it's just Thorek's that can do that. Mainly that's down to old Ironbrow himself. He knows more about the runes than any other dwarf alive, and that's just 'cause he's spent his whole life reading the ancient texts and talking with the oldest and wisest runelords.
Thorgrim eyed his audience carefully.
And paying attention to his elders.
Thorek's rune items. Clad Brakak. Thorek's anvil-headed hammer is a formidable weapon of war, as well as a useful tool. In his position as master of the weaponsmiths of Karak Azgal, he has access to a vast amount of ancient rune lore. From his researches and experiments, he has designed a new rune which he has struck onto his hammer. This rune is unique to Thorek's hammer, Cladbrakak, as he only made it a couple of centuries ago, and wants to give it a fair trial before using it again. In battle, it is easy to find Thorek as his hammer shatters armor when it strikes, making a sound like thunder. Craggy, the best of Thorek's assistants, accompanies him to battle and helps him by preparing some of his runes. Most of the time, this is a big help and speeds things up, but occasionally his lack of experience, he's hardly been smithing a century, lets him down, and he makes a mistake. Rune of Doom. When Kurgaz forged the Anvils of Doom many centuries ago, the most potent rune they had beaten onto them was the Rune of Doom, after which they were named. However, this rune is so difficult and dangerous to use that its secret has almost been lost. Some have not ever dared to use it, or have never seen a threat they deemed sufficient to warrant its power. Others have tried and failed to contain and focus its might, and their anvils have been torn apart by the uncontrolled energies. Today, the only remaining Runelord who has the skill and courage to attempt it is Thorek Ironbrow. When this rune is struck, the air grows chill and the skies turn dark. Ghostly forms of ancient warriors appear amidst the dwarves on the battlefield, bolstering their ranks and their courage. These are not ghosts as such, but a manifestation of the dwarfs' own grim and doom-laden nature, their anger at the loss of their mighty civilization, and the desecration of their holds fills them with a righteous fury that is terrible to behold, and their normally grim faces are set with an expression of black vengeance. Dwarf King Alrik Ranulfsson of Karak.
Now, if anyone could help soothe the parched throat of an old warrior, I would continue. When I was a young'un, there was never any need for a battle-scarred veteran to ask for a drink, as his cup was always full. Nor was it... Whoa, thank you.
Thorgrim drained the newly filled flagon in a single long draught, wiping the foam from his mustache with the back of his hand as he banged the mug on the table to be filled again.
Now where was I? Oh yes, the few noble dwarfs left that keep the old ways. Thorek, I've told you about. But there's also King Alrik Ranulfsson of Karak. Even though he has to deal with all the lesser races who come to trade with him, King Alrik has stayed true to the old ways. The army of Karak is a sight to make your heart glad, with ranks of clansmen and ironbreakers backed up by loyal dwarves with crossbows. Just like it was in the old days. None of your modern rubbish like flame cannons and gyrocopters littering the place and stinking up the clean mountain air with their fumes. Don't know what those engineers were thinking anyhow. Karak is one of the younger holds, founded after the Great Quakes. It was a tragic time, and what were needed were great leaders. The founder of Karak, Alrik's great-great-great-grandfather, was one such dwarf. Kurgaz was probably the tallest and strongest of our kind ever to smite an elf. He stood head and shoulders above his followers and could lift an entire ore wagon single-handed as he fled the disasters of those dark times with his army of followers. He happened upon the mountain which would be his new home. Karak, the Hornhold. Kurgaz was camped with his kinsmen above ground in a small valley, an unusual and troubling practice, but necessary when the trembling earth is twisting even the finest dwarf-wrought tunnels. As dusk drew in, the deep blare of a dwarf war horn sounded across the valley. Thinking his kind were in danger, Kurgaz rallied his bodyguard about him and set off towards the sound. They climbed for hours, feeling for handholds as they approached the sound which still sounded eerily across the mountains. Just as dawn broke, they reached a large cave and stopped to rest. Without warning, the wind blew through the entrance of the cave, down the passageways, and all around them, causing the deep roar that had summoned them. Karaz roared in turn, but this time with laughter, and soon the whole of his guard had tears running down their cheeks. "It is a sign from Grungi," he said, "to show us how to laugh even in such times as these, and to show us a safe haven." And with that, he set about exploring his new domain. Over the years, the caverns have been greatly enlarged, and the winds still blow through the horn hall of Hirn. Cleverly constructed doors, valves, and hollows amplify the sound just so, and cunningly set fires draw the air through the sounding chambers, so that the mountain itself can be sounded to call the warriors to battle, or scare away trolls. Now, as I said, young Alrik is even more traditional than his father Ranulf, and his armies are a sight to make an old warrior glad. But there's more to him than that, for he has taken Karak Azgal's Book of Grudges and sought with single-minded dedication to erase every slight. To this end, he campaigns against greenskins, Skaven, or elves, and extracts a payment in blood for their past misdeeds. It is often that you hear of how your kin have been badly mistreated, but few seek vengeance like Alrik. He would erase every grudge ever held by his clan, and if he lives long enough by Grungi, he'll do it. Already he carries one of the volumes of the book, completely scoured of unpaid blood debts. This alone fills his followers with boundless hope, as it does me, and should you. A note from King Alrik Ranulfsson of Karak Azgal. When I were but a lad, my father the king taught me 3 things. Never accept a gift from an elf. Never trust gold that glistens in darkness. Never forget a grudge. On his deathbed, I swore to uphold these values to my own dying day. And Grungi willing, I will. The rune items of King Alrik Ranulfsson. Acts of Retribution. As the Karak Azgal dwarves fight their enemies, the bright flash of silver is easily seen as the axe of retribution rises and falls in deadly arcs. Alrik had this axe made especially for his crusade to avenge the wrongs done to his hold, and he has sworn not to let it rest until they have all been struck from the Book of Grudges. Proppy clad, suits of heavy golden armor are the traditional battle garb of the king of Karak Azgal and his shield bearers. They are plain and unadorned in the functional manner of the dwarves, but the protection they offer is far greater than any suit of finely filigreed elven armor. Karaz's shield. This ancient shield bears a protective magical rune, but is of tremendous size and is far too heavy to use normally. However, since it is a valued heirloom of their founder, the kings of Karak Azgal still take it to battle, nowadays as a fighting platform borne by 2 of their strongest followers. Helm of Eagles. The cunningly wrought runes on this ancient battle helm give the wearer the sharp eyesight of the hunting eagle as he soars above his prey. No lurking assassins can hide from him, nor secrets be held from him while he wears this helm. Karak Azgal's Book of Grudges.
The great Book of Grudges Damazkron is held by the High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer. But this is not the only such book. In fact, each hold has their own book, as indeed do many individual dwarves. Actually, this is only one volume of the many that comprise Karak Hirn's collection of grudges. However, this is a unique volume, because all the grudges described in its pages have been avenged. Stories of the Dwarves. The walls rang to the thunderous clanging of hammers on anvils, the scrape of blades on whetstones, and the roar of 100 furnaces. In the ruddy gloom, the dwarves toiled wordlessly, sweat beading their heavy brows. The air was dry and hot, yet each labored in a heavy jerkin. Some of them even still wore their mail, and their hands were covered with heavy gauntlets. "How do they stand the heat?" asked Logan Beckenstroff, envoy for the Elector Count of Averland. The gangly manling stood 2 feet taller than the smith beside him, his ruffed shirt and embroidered doublet a stark contrast to the plain leather apron of the dwarf.
"They're dwarfs,"
Draki Snarrenson replied gruffly in answer, as if that were answer enough. In contrast to his unadorned work clothes, the dwarf smith's heavy black beard was intricately plaited and bound with gold bands, tucked into his rope belt to keep it out of harm's way. Dark eyes glittered from under a thick mop of black hair as he looked up at Logan. "Of course," the man murmured diplomatically. "I should have realized."
"This here is the second foundry level,"
Draki continued, ignoring the manling's interruption. He had only been showing the envoy the forges and foundries and workshops for 2 days, but was beginning to suspect the flighty man was getting bored. He mentally shrugged. Men had such short memories and attention spans. It was best to drum it home.
"Here most of the apprentices work, from the clans of the southern tunnels down to the 15th level. I'm in charge of this lot of beardlings, which is why I'm giving you the show around. I'm getting them to make your swords for you."
"You are entrusting our swords, which we are paying good gold for and no small amount, to your apprentices?" Logan asked the question lightly out of tact, yet inside, he was furious. How could the Count's personal guard expect to perform well with work of youngsters and journeymen?
"That's right,"
Draki replied curtly. Logan gritted his teeth for a moment before continuing. "For the price we're paying, we expect the highest standards of quality." He looked down at the dwarf's face and was met by a furious scowl.
"Here now, watch your tongue, manling,"
the smith snorted, balling his fists onto his hips.
"Them swords'll be better than any manling craft, have no worries about that. If you want swords, you'll get sword work. That's no real test of an artisan's skill, no it ain't. Any beardling can slap a sword together in a few days. Ain't much craftsmanship in that. Anyhows, we ain't going to use them. Not for fighting like you strange manlings. No, apprentices practice on swords. Then it doesn't matter. Now if you wanted a proper weapon like a hammer or axe, then you'd get someone like me doing it. But then you'd pay for my time too. We can't have skilled smiths like me messing about making swords. Can we?
Under the smith's withering glare combined with the faintness in his head caused by the extreme heat, Logan felt weak and helpless. Perhaps he wouldn't mention this part in his report to the Elector Count.
"Well,"
the old dwarf demanded,
"you still want them or not? If you don't best say so now, then you only have to pay for the 50 we made so far."
"A fair offer," Logan started. but changed his mind as the scowl deepened even further. "But one I fear I cannot accept," he continued smoothly. "We had a deal. A bargain, in fact, I believe you called it. And we shall stick to our word."
"Right then,"
Draki said, lightening his mood.
"Now I'll take you down to the mines where we can discuss the timber contract for our props."
As he led the man through the din and inferno, Draki had to stop himself chuckling. It had been a close-run thing. He'd almost lost the deal. But as his grandfather taught him, never bargain with a dwarf in his own home. The realms of the dwarves. Before me stood a heavily reinforced iron door. The guards saluted the approaching Ironbeard, and pulling a massive set of keys from his belt, he opened the lock. My first sight of the treasure contained within this chamber came as I saw the dwarf guard's face reflect the golden light of the room. As the doors opened, I was presented with a sight that few will ever behold. To my dying day, the image will forever be burned onto my mind. On each wall of the large chamber hung an assortment of weapons, armor, and shields, rack upon rack of axes, hammers, and, to my great surprise, swords filled the chamber. These weapons were not run-of-the-mill items either. Many were wrought from only the finest metals, and each had been meticulously polished. Hammers of all shapes and sizes lined the racks next to axes the likes of which I have never seen. Fantastic emblems of dwarf images such as dragons, or the masks of Grungi and Grimnir, shone brightly on the shields. My eyes were slowly drawn to the far end of the room. On this wall, there was arranged but one set of war gear. It was a complete set of armor, including a shield and helmet made from the finest gromro. The ornate rune cast upon the breastplate of the suit seemed at first to reflect the light of the torches. It was only on close inspection that I realized that it glowed brightly, empowered with some magic source. A great axe hung from the wall. The weapon's blade looked sharper than a razor, and not a single notch could be found along its edge. I had little doubt that this axe had seen combat, for runes of battle were engraved upon it. Yet I could not fail to be astounded at the beauty of such a weapon considering its vicious purpose. Great wings adorned the side of the full-face helmet, and I could but only imagine the size of the bird they had once been attached to. As I left the chamber, the Ironbeard told me how these wings had been taken from a giant eagle which had attacked the High King in the War of Vengeance. The king had slain the beast and its rider in one fell swipe with his mighty axe. Never again will I see such an armory of that, I am sure. The dwarves have earned a new respect from me as weaponsmiths beyond comparison. From the memoirs of Leopold Vorwatz, envoy of the Emperor Boris Goldgather. The gates of Karaz Akarak, translated into the human tongue, roughly means the pinnacle of the mountains. It is the largest of the dwarf strongholds, and is one of the most magnificent pieces of architecture in the world. Hidden from view by a winding pass that cuts its way through the world's edge mountains. As you round yet another outcrop on your long trek through the steep, treacherous pass, the full splendor of the gates of Karaz Akarak suddenly looms before you. The sheer size of the gates will take your breath away. Standing at over 400 feet tall, the gates appear to be carved into the mountainside. A solid flat bastion of stone reaches up to embrace the clouds, and if you turn your head towards the sky, you can just make out the glint of a multitude of armored figures patrolling the upper wall. Carved into the gate is the symbol of Valea, the dwarf ancestor goddess. Her image on the gates is said to protect the city from harm and evil magics. No visitor ever approaches Karaz unannounced. Miles before even a lone traveler reaches the gates, his progress will have been spied by the many hidden watchposts that overlook the Everpeak Pass. A lone dwarf in full-clad regalia will await you on your arrival. He bears the title of Gatekeeper, and it is to him, and him alone, that you must state your business. Few these days are allowed access to the great dwarf city. Once the gates stood open to all visitors, and the dwarf race was more than welcoming to strangers in their realm. Years of war and devastation have changed that forever, and now they do not encourage contact with other races. Should a visitor have good reason, and very good reason only, to enter the kingdom of Karaz, the gatekeeper will knock rhythmically on the door 5 times with his intricately carved rune hammer. Then trace the sign of a secret rune into its flat surface. Silvery seams, once invisible to even the closest inspection of the smooth granite surface, suddenly appear. Seemingly from out of nowhere, a doorway no more than 4 foot high and 3 foot wide opens. It has been many centuries since the High King gave instruction to a gatekeeper to open the main gates. In the year following the terrible earthquake that shook many of the dwarf realms to their very foundations, Morgrim Ironbeard, the High King of the time, ordered the gates to be closed. This dour period of dwarf history is known as the Time of Woes. Many of the dwarf strongholds were under attack from hordes of greenskins, and Skaven that flooded out from the caverns to take advantage of the devastation that the earthquake had unleashed on the dwarves. In his wisdom, the king shut off access to the great city. In doing so, he also shut off the dwarves from contact with the outside world, and it has remained much this way to the current day. The gates are only opened to allow the High King's army to march to war. In the rare event that this happens, the gates are opened in silence with no ceremony. Dwarves do not celebrate war, and a dwarf army on the march from Karaz, whilst a sight to behold, is a solemn affair. The gates of the city have only ever been besieged twice in its long history, and both times the besiegers have been forced to abandon their attempts. Even the largest of the great war machines that the orc warlord Ugrok Beardburner brought to bear on the gate barely caused an indentation into the thick stone. The orc warlord himself realized the futility of trying to break down the gate with the giant battering ram he had constructed, and the dwarves sallied forth and destroyed his horde as he lifted the siege. It is said that amongst the defenses of the city, great rivers of molten lava can be poured from the mouths of the carved stone dragons that sit atop the outer wall of the gate. Also, it is claimed that the hills around the approach to the gates are filled with powerful steam engines, which can cause avalanches and rock slides, and even drop lengths of the path into hidden chasms and crevasses. All dwarves hold hope in their hearts that one day the giant gate of the great stronghold will open once more, and that fine dwarf craftsmanship will once again be available to trade across the world. Until that day, the dwarves continue to remain safely protected from the outside world, behind the stone fortress that protects their city. Of all the great halls in the dwarf kingdoms, none has ever surpassed the size, grandeur, and sheer elegance of the High King's Hall in Karaz. Few outsiders have ever been granted an audience inside the hall. Those who have been so fortunate tell tales of a great vault, so large that it could contain a small human town. The tall roof of the vault is supported by a forest of pillars. Precisely 1,000 of these pillars stretch toward the ceiling. Each pillar has been ornately carved by one of the dwarf clans. On them is carved the symbols and histories of each of the clans. Many of the pillars are only carved just over halfway. These are the pillars of those clans whose line has been wiped out. Others are almost fully carved from the foot to the top. Each decade, a member of the clan will travel to the Great Hall and spend months recording the history onto the stone. The ceiling of the hall is embedded with sapphires and diamonds. These are placed specifically to represent the constellations of the stars. This planetarium is believed to have been the working of high elves in the distant days, when the two nations were united, though no dwarf will ever speak of this. These stones glitter as they reflect the light cast upon them from the many bronze braziers that are placed at equal short-spaced intervals down the length of the hall. These braziers are finely cast, and each one has a ruby set into it. Each of these rubies are the same size, and each one has been identically cut to have the same number of faces on it. If a jewelsmith were ever allowed to examine these stones, he would be astounded at the flawless quality of the gems. The glow of the flames illuminates the intricately carved walls. The carvings depict the history of the dwarf race, beginning with the legends of the ancestor gods and telling of each major event, and a few of the more obscure minor affairs that have shaped dwarf history. When a new king is crowned, he must be able to recite this history word for word before the coronation takes place. This ceremony can take days, and the king is fully expected to know every name and detail of each and every incident. Unlike the short-lived memories of men, dwarves are able to recall precisely even insignificant moments of their long lives. A red carpet runs down the mile-long length of the hall to a wide and very steep set of steps made from black marble that reaches up towards the dais. Upon the dais is the High King's throne. The throne of power has been in use by the High Kings for over 4,000 years. 4 bodyguards lay claim to the honor of being the throne bearers. This honor is given only to the strongest of dwarves, who have proved themselves loyal and brave in many battles. It is said that the throne of power was carved by Grungi himself. He worked the great rune of Azamar into it, known as the Rune of Eternity, and such is its power that no runesmith has ever been able to copy it. Dwarf legend foretells that should the rune ever fail to protect the throne, then the dwarf race will be doomed. The hall has been cleverly designed so that when the king gives audience, he is able to speak in whispered tones, and even a dwarf at the very back of the hall would be able to hear him, as clearly as if he were stood right next to him. Twice every century, a dwarf representative will travel to the hall for the Day of Grudgment. On this day, the representatives will each take it in turns to recite which grudges have been righted, and then they will in turn list those grudges which have since been added to their own books. The High King himself will either strike these out from his own great book of grudges, or add them to it. As it is a magical tome, Only the High King himself knows whether the long list grows or shrinks. But from the dour demeanor of the High King, it seems that the dwarves will be bearing grudges for many more centuries to come. There are many halls built in Karaz, most of which lie deserted and have not been entered in many centuries. The dwarves gather in numbers in the west halls of the old city, but they still send their armies off to cleanse out a hall if they hear word that it has been overrun with goblins or skaven. When they cleanse a hall, they will spend many years restoring it to its former glory before sealing the doors until the day that the dwarf nation is once again strong enough to reclaim the mountains. A transcription from the Book of Grudges of Clam Kamerad. 2005. In the spring of this year, the dwarf trader Gory Dustbrow was murdered and his wares stolen by the treacherous elves. For this unforgivable act, we will take vengeance on the so-called fair folk. 2005. In Dweraki Grongi Nagron, the dwarf settlement of Mingol Norn was found burned to the ground. Arrows of elven design were found amongst the dead. For this we shall ne'er forgive the sons of Belshazzar. 2005. The murderous elves who did kill the people of Mingol Norn were found a short way down the track. They denied any wrongdoing, but guilt was deemed written upon their faces, and so they did suffer the penalty of death for their misdoings. 1997. Word has reached us that we are to gather the clans into arms. The ambassador of King Gotrek Starbreaker did return from his mission of goodwill with his beard shaven by the people of Ulthuan. For this wrong we shall not cease until every head is sheared from the shoulders of each and every elf. 1974. Woe be it written that Prince Snorri has been slain by the dark hand of an elf king. Let this misdeed be avenged afore any more grudges weigh the dwarf nation with grief. 1968. Let it be recorded that members of our very own clan hath aided in the settlement of the murder of the prince. For at the Battle of Orgor did our clan's warriors fight, and 'twas there did the elf lord Imladrir righteously meet his doom. 1948. Let the burning of our neighbors at Mingol Norn be accounted for. The good news that the vile city of Athel Mariah has been put to the torch did reach us today. For that we owe Morgrim a debt. 1560. Let it be recorded that on the 4th day of Smirnikul Odraraki, the elven host did leave the old world to return to their accursed shores. With the demise of the elf king Calador, the High King has claimed his crown in recompense. Let it be said that grudges outstanding against the elves are now but a few, though let their treachery never be forgiven. 1500. Lest they ever be forgot, we recorded herein the names of those clans which have perished during the great cataclysm. The dwarves of the Black Tash, Hithammers, and Firebrands will never again walk the mountain passes. Forever shall they be remembered. Word has also reached us that the Ungrim is impassable. 1499. Word has reached us that our cousins in the hold of Karak Azgal hath lost their ancestral home to Groby. We shall offer them place to stay till that time when they shall reclaim their hold, and put the vile greenskins to pay for their foul actions. 1494. On the 9th day in the month of Sizraki Grimnirbrur, the hordes attacked our own hold. We have beaten successive waves off, yet still more attempt to breach our defenses. For this act we shall seek retribution. 1490. The greenskins have all but been fought off, but with the breaking of the siege, word has reached us about the fall of Barak Varr.
and the loss of the great mines at Erkrund. For their evil we shall not rest until each grubby has his head on a stake outside the taken citadels. 1469. Let it be recorded that the dwarves of Karak Azgal have requested the use of 5 of our finest steam rollers. This favour we grant, only to open up a communication with our neighbours. 1456. Our jewelsmiths mourn the loss of Gadrin Wholeheart, who is said to have fallen in defence of the gold mines at Gunbad. We shall cast a ring of the purest gold inset with the finest Bernduraz stone to mark his passing. He who brings those responsible for his death to justice shall bear the honour to wear the ring. 1366. With the fall of Karak Silverspear, our cousins in the east have fallen in dire need of help. Alas, we have troubles of our own. Our routes to the strongholds have become treacherous, and many are the number of orc and grubby whom we shall bring to pay for their foul deeds. We have lost 7 ore trains to attack from the murderous creatures. 1245. Hear the revelations that Karaz Karak has beaten off an invading horde of vile beasts. Many ogres and trolls did fall under dwarf axe. May they pass by our gates so we can repay them for their years of evil doing. Messages have reached us at the hall of our ancestors. Barak Axbearer has been reclaimed. We owe much gratitude to the dwarves of King Morgrim Blackbeard for their valiant efforts, and hold hope within our hearts that we can soon pay homage at the shrine. 1201. Today is a day of great celebration. A trade treaty has been made with our neighbours in the hold of Karak Azgal. In return for 1,000 tons of copper ore, we shall be sending them 200 tons of iron. 1190. Cadrin Redmayne has left our hold in search of vengeance upon the swarms of Skaven that soiled the tunnels of Barak Varr. 1185. Let it be noted that we have avenged the deaths of those who fell to the blades of Grubby and Skaven at Barak Varr. Cadrin Redmayne will forever be recognized in our histories as he who claimed a grudge. 1136. Woe of days that I must record the murder of Cadrin Redmayne. Though over 30 orcs lay at his feet, thrice that number shall we reap vengeance upon, before we could even begin to pay him the honour that he is due. 1101. In celebration of the 100 years of trade between ourselves and Karak Azgal, the wedding of our own Prince Gumle and the Princess Durtane has been arranged. 1101. So offended was Prince Gumle by the appearance of Princess Durtane that she has been sent back to Karak Azgal. 'Tis recorded that she had a face like a troll chewing on a rock. We have kept her dowry as recompense for the wrongs that our eyes had to endure. 975. Today is a day of mourning. Prince Fergil Morgrimson of Karaz breathes no more. He was slain in a brave attempt to clear the lower halls of Karak from Skaven. Many thousand of the rats that we shall destroy in his name. 750. Word has come from the south that vast numbers of goblins have gathered at Karak Azgal. We shall be sending our clans to aid them in this time of trouble. 739. Our clans have returned jubilant. Many are the number of grubby that have fallen to their axes. Many more are the numbers that we need to purge before we can once again hold our heads high in honor of the fallen. 618. The dwarves of Karak Azgal have still to return our steamrollers. We have sent word that we demand their return, but have had no reply back. Barak Varr. Barak Varr, or the Gate to the Sea,
is unique amongst the dwarf strongholds. Approaching from the land, there is no indication at all of the busy port that lies ahead. In fact, even standing on the cliff edge, it seems to the unsuspecting eye that the ships are destined to smash themselves into the cliff face. The powerful tides of the Black Gulf have carved out a deep cave system into the tall, white cliffs. Here, in these vast sea caverns, the dwarfs harbor their trading fleet. The stronghold of Barak Varr is small in comparison to the other strongholds that tunnel deep into the World's Edge Mountains. But the dwarves of the hold enjoy a relatively cosmopolitan lifestyle, and are less dour and introverted than other dwarves. Not only is it one of the few strongholds that has remained open to traders from other nations, but the dwarves of Barak Varr are renowned for their hospitality. It is said that a dwarf breakfast is a feast large enough to fill even the belly of the plumpest halfling. Dwarves have a strong dislike for water, and the dwarves at Barak Varr are unusual in that some of them become sailors. Even so, they still do not relish setting foot on flimsy wooden ships which could easily break up in a strong gale. They put their faith in huge iron constructions, driven by paddles powered by steam boilers, which are located deep within the armored hulls of these vessels, the workings of which are kept secret by the dwarf engineers. Traders of every realm, from Araby to Lustria, gather together at Barak Varr knowing that they can expect the legendary hospitality of the dwarves to refresh them on their arrival. Amongst the most famous locations within Barak Varr is the White Pony Tavern, where they stock a variety of beers and spirits from all around the known world, and a traveler can spend days there without ever sampling a drink twice. In the market area of the port, a visitor can buy anything, from fine Araby silks to exotic Lustrian statues, halfling mixed spices to fertility charms from the Southlands. Because it is tunneled into the cliffs, the stronghold is almost impervious to attack by land. More than one nation has tried to assault Barak Varr by sea in the past, but the immense firepower of the dwarf fleet has always driven away enemy armadas, combined with the many cannons whose barrels bristle from revetments along the cliff face. An enemy fleet has to be very brave to approach the stronghold. Only a fool fights a fort. Although it is strictly located in the lands of the border princes, this is diplomatically ignored by the estranged dukes and barons, as the stronghold protects them from invasion. The generosity favored to the dwarves also extends to the dwarves' free passage along the many trade routes that lead through the border princes. If truth be known, the dwarves inhabited the border princes long before any other race laid claim to that land, and probably constructed the roads themselves. It is, in fact, the dwarves who put up with the presence of men in their ancestral realm, purely because there is very little mineral wealth to be mined from the lands. 2 letters from Jacob Stacheldhorf. From the east pass of Karaz, I began my trek along the Silver Road. Most passes to the east of the World's Edge Mountains are dangerous routes, and within a few miles of leaving the vicinity of the dwarf stronghold, I found my path difficult to travel. Night Goblin tribes and Orc bandits have claimed ownership of the eastern half of the World's Edge mountain range, and will attack any intruders. I was reliably informed that the Silver Road was the safest route to the east since the dwarves have managed to hold most of the surrounding mountains. Once the route was well traveled. My guide told me that vast mule trains permanently trekked back and forth along the road carrying loads of silver ore on their backs, from which some scholars believe the road's name originates. The route descends steeply through the Deadrock Gap, where even dwarves are now hesitant to go,
It was here that my guide left me to return to the safety of his hold. I carefully made my way down the slope, losing only one mule on the treacherously narrow path, as well as the usual tribes of goblins that now inhabit the ruins of Mount Silverspear. At certain times of the year, many giants gather here. It is largely believed that they group together for some ritualistic ceremony. The intrepid halfling adventurer Will Bow is the only known witness of the ceremony, and he paled, refusing to talk of the subject when I began to inquire about his experience. Whatever the dark nature of the gathering, the giants revel in hurling huge boulders down into the path at any creatures that should be unfortunate enough to catch their attention. Care should be taken if you intend to travel this route, and a sturdy, preferably dwarf-made helmet is highly recommended. Once I safely made it through the deadrock gap, the road continued on through the blasted wastes. It stretched on into the distance as far as my eye could see. Opinion varies as to the final destination of this road, and as to who constructed it, and more importantly, why. Nonetheless, few dwarves who have ever traveled the road past Mount Silverspear have ever returned. Of those rare few who have, I found them reluctant to speak of what lies to the east of the World's Edge Mountains, cursing in their own tongue, and falling silent. It is with trepidation of my journey ahead that I dispatch this scroll by means of carrier bird. I trust that it reaches you, and pray that you will receive another soon. Your faithful servant, Jacob. I had expected the Underway, or Ungrim as it is known in the Kazalid tongue, to be a treacherous ruined route. My research into the histories of the dwarf nations led me to believe that it had been virtually destroyed in the time of woes. To my great amazement, what I found was a road that makes the street of Sigmar in Altdorf seem like a farm track in comparison. Wide enough for 2 cavalry regiments to pass each other with ease, the Ungrim is truly spectacular. I hired a guide to escort me to my destination of Karak Azgal, although I planned to make a detour to encompass a visit to Zufbar en route. My guide informed me on some of the history of the Ungrim. It would seem that it was constructed in the time of a High King Snorri Whitebeard. Originally, it was designed to link the northern strongholds with those of the south, as the winding, treacherous mountain routes proved to exact a high toll on dwarf ore shipments. As trade began to flourish, the dwarves saw a need to expand the route. A series of routes were added to the main road, Umwan, in Kazalid, linking each of the major dwarf settlements together. Before the great earthquakes, the dwarf engineers had even constructed a gigantic steam-driven wagon, which pulled carts filled with ore up and down the route. Unfortunately, all this was destroyed in the time of woes. The great earthquakes collapsed many of the sections of the Ungrim, and blocked off communications between the strongholds. Most of the mountain passes had been usurped by goblins, and were no longer safe to travel, and thus the strongholds found themselves isolated and vulnerable to attack. It was with this in mind that I expected to find a ruinous rocky route, but my expectations were proved wrong. The dwarves have rebuilt much of the northern section of the Umwan, and many of its tributary roads. Every 20 feet a massive oil torch burns, lighting up the busy route. Gigantic pillars reach up 100 feet to the ceiling of the Underway, which is so smoothly hewn from the rock that it reflects the light of the torches. Many engineers are busy constructing areas of the route, though what they are actually doing I can but speculate. Most of those engineers whom we passed were busy in conversation, and seemed little concerned by the disruption that their work caused. More carts than I have ever laid eyes upon travel the Ungrim, all laden with precious ores and gemstones. As I passed some tributary routes, I took note that they were blocked off from access, and many had guards posted at their entrances. These, my guide informed me, were sections that are still ruinous. Many of these routes are accompanied by hordes of Skaven and goblins, who took advantage of the earthquakes to take them over. From what my guide told me, I gathered that it is the dwarfs' highest priority to clear these sections of vermin and to once again link all the dwarf holds. Should they achieve this, I have little doubt that once again the dwarf nation will flourish. Your most faithful servant, Jacob. The Journal of Jacob Stacheldhorf. Travels through the World's Edge Mountains. Day 29. I have begun my trek up Karaz Whitecap. I find myself having to regularly stop for breath. The air as we ascend the mountain grows thin, and I cannot walk for more than an hour before I must stop. My dwarf guide is most patient with me, although I have a little doubt that such is the vigor and stamina of these stout fellows that he could easily have reached the top by now without any need for rest. We have made camp for the evening at a beautiful site that overlooks the great lake of Blackwater. In the distance, I can just make out the ruins of Cragmere. From this high vantage point, had I not known of the beasts and monsters that now inhabit the former stronghold, I would have thought it no different from any other of the great holds. Day 30. My sleep was disturbed by the bellows of the stone trolls that stalk the mountainsides. Many was the time I woke believing the strong winds that buffeted my tent in the night to be my impending doom, at the claws of one of these monstrous creatures. By noon we had reached the top of the mountain. My legs gave way to the sight before me. A bridge arcs high between the peaks of Karaz Whitecap and Carrig Fangorn. I cannot even hazard a guess at how the dwarves built such a structure, or why. I can now understand why the dwarves call this bridge Ekrund Grom, or the Stair of Courage. My guide has informed me that we shall not be making the crossing today as the winds are too strong. I thank Sigmar for his mercy, but know that this is a brief respite before I must search my heart to summon the courage to cross. Day 31. A party of troll slayers have arrived at the summit. Usually loners, they have gathered together to perform a rite of passage for one of their number. For some unknown reason, Troll's guts, acquired from a recent victorious battle, were tied to his ankles. What happened next was beyond my comprehension. He walked to the center of the bridge carrying a large boulder, to which was tied the other end of the length of troll gut. Placing the boulder, he then jumped off the bridge to what I thought was his doom. Amazingly, the troll guts are so tough, they took his weight and he was catapulted back up towards the bridge. After retrieving their comrade, the small party offered me the chance to undertake this ritual. But I value my life more than these strange cast of dwarves, and politely declined. Day 32. Today I finally summoned up the courage to cross the sky bridge. My guide informed me that I was the first man to do so since Sigmar himself. I must admit, though, it was not easy to do. The bridge is wide enough to accommodate several dwarves abreast at its start, but by the time I had traversed its path to the center, it becomes barely a few feet wide. I was very glad to reach the other side and start my descent to the stronghold of Karak Kadrin, where I intend to visit the famed Slayer's Shrine. After finally meeting some of this legendary cast, albeit in such strange circumstances, I will regard these doomed dwarves with a new respect. A letter from Beleragond.
To his most venerable lord, Duragar. I trust this message meets you strong in mind and wide in girth.
'Tis a welcome change that I may send you news of our fortune. Yet rejoice not early, as though the message I send is of great tidings. The time of celebration has yet to pass. I will remind you of our last communication, though I know I need not do so. My clan had spent many years gathering strength in preparation to march south. It was with high spirits that we set forth on the ancient pass. Once again the kinsfolk of Lun were eager to feel the soil of our homeland beneath our boots. Far too many centuries had passed since dwarf eyes had fallen upon Bala Arlungul. The journey was swift, and neither Groby nor Gronti barred our way. We entered the basin where one of the cities stood proud and tall, via the pass that winds its way around the Kvinvir. The sight of the fortifications, though they lay in ruinous form, stirred each warrior's heart with a passion that never I have ever felt before. A murmur grew up from the army and could not be quelled. I wish I could claim that our route down the northern approach to the Khazad was met with the same joy. But the vile Groby totems of poor hapless adventurers brought down their spirits. Their scrolls now hailed our arrival and brought swift reminder of the dangers we faced. As we passed through the ruins of the North Gate, a tide of black-robed night goblins poured from the walls and amassed before us. Forming into solid shield walls, my warriors prepared for their onslaught. Crazed fanatics fueled by toxic fungi took a heavy toll of many of my kinsfolk, as did the vicious cave squigs, whose huge teeth tore through even our toughest armor. Huge boulders crashed down upon our ranks, and great spears were launched into our midst. Yet with stout courage did the proud army hold fast. We met the charge of vile Groby, whose number tripled that of our small band. Wave after wave of gibbering greenskins sallied from the ruins, but in our hearts, we knew vengeance was at hand. With the names of our fallen forefathers on our lips, each dwarf amongst our clan took revenge. By evening there was not one greenskin who could draw breath remaining within the city walls. As I write this message, my warriors and engineers are hastily constructing a barricade around the inner wall. Once word is spread, you can be sure as gold shines and elves lie that many more Groby will gather to try to retake what is not theirs to possess. Already my sentries have spied movement amongst the debris that now litters what was once the outer walls. If we are to stand any chance of holding our position within the city, then we will need the reinforcements. The time to reclaim the southern holds is at hand, but lies not within my power alone to do so. My kin already owe you more than we can ever repay for your generous hospitality in letting us take refuge in Karaz or Karak. If you could send any help to aid us in this time of need, then one day I can but dream that the proud city of Karak Eight Peaks can repay your friendship. Honorably yours, Beleragond.
Karak Azgal. In its heyday, the city of jewels, Karak Azgal, in the dwarf tongue, formed perhaps the most extravagant hold that has ever been built. Once ranked amongst the largest dwarf settlements, whose wealth exceeded that of even Karaz. This fortune would ultimately lead to its downfall. Built within a mountain range that contained particularly large deposits of a variety of gemstones. It is said that such was the wealth in the city, that every dwarf house had a large gem as its doorknob. With the fall of Karak Eight Peaks, many of the trade routes to the other dwarf strongholds were opened to the orcs. Taking full advantage of this, the orcs, already encouraged by their victory, poured through these passes and assaulted the neighboring holds. Even the orcs had heard of the wealth of Karak Azgal and flocked to breach its sturdy gates. The attack caught the fortress by surprise and was orchestrated with an intense ferocity fueled by greed for the dwarves' gemstones. The greenskins amassed on the north wall,
This section of the fortress had particularly weak defenses, as the dwarves in their pride had thought Karak Eightpeaks, which faced this wall, would never fall. Following the destruction of Karak Eightpeaks, the Skaven had begun to swarm into the southern mountains. The Skaven masses had, for many years, been tunneling into the deepest dwarf gem mines, and their leaders decided to use the orc attack to their advantage. The dwarves of Karak Israel found themselves under attack from their weak north wall and from the mines below. Faced on two weak flanks by far superior numbers, the dwarves knew that they stood no chance of saving the city. But dwarves would rather die than give up their treasure. The dwarf defenders gathered in a deep vault, and it was here they made their stand against the massed attack from both Skaven and orcs, hungry for dwarf blood. As the last dwarf fell, the orc general realized that the defense of the vault had been a clever ruse. The moment the orcs breached the wall and poured into the city, a small unit of engineers, accompanied by the Runelord Stormbeard, had carried the treasures to a separate vault, away from the main city, and sealed up the vast hoard in the cave. Whilst the doomed dwarf warriors sold their lives dearly to gain time, Stormbeard had inscribed special runes of hiding, so that only he would ever know the exact location of the door to the treasure. The dwarves vowed to return, and what better incentive than an enormous pile of precious stones? On leaving the doomed city, the Runelord renamed the once grand stronghold Karak Azgal, or Horde Peak. After the destruction of Karak Azgal, the dragon Graug the Terrible made his nest within the ruins. Dragons have a unique ability to smell gold and precious stone, and so Graug soon discovered the vault. These monstrous creatures attract a mate through the size of their treasure hoard, and Graug added to the already vast hoard over the following centuries. Where there lies treasure and dragons, there also follow adventurers and treasure seekers. Many expeditions were sent by the Dwarf Jewelsmiths Guild, but it was a young beardling by the name of Scalf who finally discovered the lost vault and slew the dragon. His descendants have used the wealth to build up a small fortress within the ruined city. This small stronghold has become a haven for adventurers to strike out in exploration of the goblin-infested ruins. Ever since Karak Eightpeaks was taken, the dwarves hold out against attack in this remote outpost, in the hope that one day soon, the southern holds will flourish once again. An excerpt from The Fall of the Southern Holds, a traditional dwarf song recanted on the eve of the fall of Karak Eightpeaks. For Scalf he was but short in size, in courage towered high. Under the lair of Graug he stepped, no fear lest he should die. Fortune blessed him with her kiss, for thus the beast it slept. Over gold and rainbow stone, the youngest dwarf he crept. The bones of men of virtue high lay scattered where they fell. For honor, had they met their death, did noble lives they sell. For many centuries had the dragon laid upon its cache. Little did the dread worm dream that it had met its match. In his hand the young dwarf bore an ancient runic blade. Upon the open neck of Graug the deepest cut it made. In the cavern did it rain a shower of gem and gold, as ancient beast formed dance of death, slain by a dwarf so bold. Dragon Slayer and his kin did city lay their claim in Karak Azgal, To this day, do Scalf clan dwarves remain. To seek a fortune risking death, a small toll you must pay. But fare ye strong in courage, then to Azgal make your way. Dwarfs at War. Sagely advice given to King Alrik when a young dwarf prince.
As king, upon your shoulders will fall the task of making war upon the enemies of the hold. These foes are many and varied, from the numerous barbaric orcs to the devious elf folk. There are 2 reasons to wage war, and 2 alone. The first is to protect the hold from invasion and to safekeep its lands, and the passage of your subjects among your realm. The second is to restore honor to the hold, whether it be for an unpaid debt, an oath sworn, or to demand reparation for those who have wronged us. These are the only reasons to take up the axe, to don the battle gear of your ancestors. Never must you wage war for personal gain, out of jealousy, spite, or other low feelings. As in all things, war must be done honorably, for though other races may slink and crawl and be treacherous and insincere, only by adhering to the traditions and tenets of your forefathers will you be able to meet them in the halls of Grimnir. When he calls your name, dishonor your clan and your hold, and there shall be no respite for you, and the dragon's flame will torment you for eternity. Thus did Grimnir speak at the dawn of time, and thus shall it be forever after. To protect your home and the homes of your subjects there are many strategies and contingencies of war that you can employ. If the force is inferior, seek them out on the mountainsides. Use your knowledge of the hills and rocks and high passes to bring you to an advantage over the enemy. And then await their arrival. Greet them with the roar of cannons and the hail of the crossbow, and bright shall the sun shine on your axes and hammers. Once you have driven them off, however, be cautious and hold your ground. A rash pursuit may lead you into a disadvantage, where an enemy may lie in wait. Better to hold and repel than to flounder into danger. If the force arrayed against you is great, then the mountains and your hold itself are your best weapons. Withdraw within your gates and bastions. There's no shame in saving dwarf lives, and it is a great crime to have your kin slain because of foolish pride. Our stone walls have endured for generations. Neither man nor orc nor elf have breached their defenses, and none ever shall. Pour upon their heads the molten metal from the forges, and dash their engines of siege to piece with rocks and cannonballs. Use the underground paths to strike at their rear, and send the discord and fear through the ranks. Destroy their war engines such as they might have, burn their baggage, and scatter their livestock so they will hunger and thirst and lose the heart for battle. Only when they have scattered should you venture forth, to clear away any stragglers, and remove the last vestiges of their presence from your lands. But remember the lesson of due caution, and drive not your army far from your gates, lest the enemy unexpectedly gather and relaunch their assault, catching you unawares. If you must, by dint of oath and duty, wage war upon a foreign land, then remember these words well. In comparison to the hordes of orcs and the teeming masses of mankind, we are few, and to attack them in much force would require you to leave your hold undefended. This is unforgivable.
So when marching to war in others' realms, muster what force you must, and march with all haste. Win the battle, and return to your defense. For others have eyes and ears, and will see your brave warriors march forth, and hear their boots upon the passes, and may decide that you are weak and vulnerable. Except against isolated fastness, it is a waste of dwarf lives to dash your army upon the walls of an enemy, shoddily built as they may seem. Instead, take up a position close to the passes and highways that he must use for commerce and military expedition, so that nothing shall pass. Choose a position that is well defensible, and await your enemy's attack. A hill overlooking a town is good, from where your war engines can hurl shot upon his people and force him to show his hand. Or the side of a valley, where he must pass his armies through, and so must clear your army from its place before he can defend other parts of his kingdom. When the attacks await him in full force, let him waste his strength upon your armor while you punish him for his assault with crossbow, handgun, stone thrower, and flame cannon. Be wary of your warriors dashing from the cover of your engines and missile fire, for sturdy as they are, a faster foe will outflank them and come upon the undefended engines, or they shall become surrounded and cut off from aid or retreat. If your foe be a coward or weakling and does nothing to protect his lands or his people from the threat of your force, you have but one option. You must then, and not before, march upon him with your warriors and force him to do battle, beating upon his door with your axes and hammers if need be. In such a force you must return your engines of war to the hold, for you must often march hard and far, and these engines will not only slow your warriors, but will provide targets for ambush. Unfettered by defending your engines, your warriors can drive into the heart of the opposing force and bring them to dreadful battle. Seek out the hardest of his units, for they will be no match for you and your veterans. But march as a single army. Do not scatter your warriors hither and thither, for they should fight as a whole, and not be unsupported. Crush his regiments in turn, turning the full force of your army upon them, until they are lying upon the ground or scattered to the hills. If the enemy surrenders, temper your treatment by their conduct and that of their peoples. If they fought bravely and with honor, as some men on occasion may do, then you can be lenient and simply demand reparations for the expense of your war. If, like the Grubby and the followers of the Dark Gods, they're beneath contempt, then feel no remorse if you slay them out of hand, for no good can come of sparing them. Elf folk should not be executed, though harsh imprisonment and hardship is well deserved. For on occasion ransom can be demanded from their king for their return, as is right, for they still owe us much for what they stole during the War of Vengeance. Others you might fight, and upon your judgment lies this burden. But remember always that Grimnir and your ancestors watch you. Upon the execution of the battle, return with all speed to your home. Dally not on the field to glorify with prideful triumph, but see to the defense of the hold. Victory celebrations are permitted, according to ancient ceremony and tradition. But first always observe the proper rites for those who will fight no more, for they shall never again celebrate alongside you until you are ushered to the hall of Grimnir. Then, upon the anvils and in the furnaces must you repair your battle gear, for though you may win a victory,
Ever are there fools in this world who will rise to challenge your might again. So fought your father, and his father, and your forefathers before them. And so fight should you.
More grudges of Clam Kamerad.
513. Alas, these are dangerous times for our empire. King Lun is currently bound for Karaz, with the news that Karak Eight Peaks has fallen into enemy hands. I fear lest the Horde take control of the southern strongholds. 469. Our fears were truly founded. I wish that I could strike out this day from our records, but to do so would dishonor those who fell in defense of our realm. Goblins do defile our temples and halls all about the south. Before he died from a wound in the back from a grubby arrow, the messenger told us that Karak Azgal and Karak have fallen to the foul greenskin. There was no word of Karak Azgal, but we can but fear the worst. The days when we could hope to avenge those who fell to orcs and their kind are disappearing. But still, we shall fight on to avenge the dead. 380. Though it is known that we shall never cease to slay orcs and grubby, let it be noted that this month they started a new account with our kind that shall only be repaid with the blood of the last goblin. 'Tis said that the High King Logan Proudbeard has been taken prisoner by orc kind. 379. The king has been saved, and many are the orcs who have been driven from Karaz. 'Tis said that at Blackwater a host of green has fled from the shores. We have sent our rangers into the mountains, in the event that those who chose to hide within our mountain will be dissuaded from making home in our land. 378. The surrounding area has been all but purged of every orc. Many gathered to be regrouped here, but our rangers' crossbows soon paid off a few grudges, and, though small are the number that we may strike off our list, great is the pleasure in doing so. 245. We've opened up a trade negotiation with mankind. I found them a slow-witted race. Still, any enemy of Grobby will find friendship amongst our people. 108. An expedition has been sent forth to recover the treasures lost at Karak Azgal, led by the bravest of our warriors, Dalid Stormbreaker. We can but wish them luck on their enterprise. 20. At last, the dwarves of Karak Azgal have sent back our steamrollers. Let it be recorded that they have been sent back in poor condition. As a result, we have closed our trade accounts with that Karak. 15. Strange are the events that pass. King Kurgan was captured by orcs, but he was rescued by mankind. Today we received proclamation that a treaty has been reached between Prince Sigmar of the Unbroken tribe and the great dwarf nation. 1. The clans have returned from war at the nearby Blackfire Pass. The victorious horns heralded their arrival. The gathered dwarf and man look to forge an alliance that will drive greenskins from the west. Many are those that can rest in their tombs tonight, for many are the grudges that have been settled in greenskin blood. 18. Thane Gotrek has noted a grudge against Thane Baron for insults made against his aunt Brodrika at the wedding of Thane Baron. 708. King Fodrin Exgirth has been said to have dishonored our own king by saying he is petty-minded. For this insult, the king has ordered that communication between the two Karaks cease. He also insisted it be recorded that we ceased communication first. 1032. Alas, the news that we have long suspected to be true has been verified. The shield and axe of Dullid Stormbreaker hath been recovered from the lair of the worm Graug. Yet fortuitous is the news that the hero's death has been avenged by Skjelf, the Dragon Slayer. 1098. A feud between the Grimbull clan and the Drucky clan has started. Thane Everlate Grimbull has refused to return a forge bellows to Thane Drucky, borrowed by his grandfather. 1111. A terrible illness has run through our halls and homes. The king himself lies feverish on his bed. It is with solemn heart that I fill his book. 1112. Alas, the king has died. I find little comfort to write that his death has not been in vain. We found many Skaven burrowing beneath our hold, but few remain to spread any more of the foul plague that has taken many dwarves to their grave. 2010. Once again dwarf and man unite. This time we fight off the evil of undeath that is afflicting the land around us. Dwarf cannon forged within the heart of our own hold soon brought the walls of Castle Templehof down. So we paid debt to those of our kin who disappeared to appease the dark thirst of these creatures. 2303. Many brave warriors have we lost to bands of marauders who have poured out from the north. I have no doubt that many more will fall to the foul chaos gods before war is ended. 2321. The clans Gotrek and Baron have reconciled the differences with a marriage between the renowned heroes Smacky Brightaxe and Dunhilda the Fair. 2420. Let the name Grom the Paunch forever be remembered as a name of terror. A goblin horde the likes of which we had never seen before has rampaged through our lands. We sent our forces to drive him away, but too thick was the green horde that enveloped our warriors. We can but hope that mankind's new empire can turn away the invading horde. 2473. Good news comes rarely, but today is a day of celebration. For Karak Eight Peaks once again lies in the hands of the dwarves. 'Tis rumoured that a descent of King Lun himself now rules over the hold. 2499. Clan Grimbull have returned the infamous Forge Bellows, and the feud with Clan Drucky is finished. 2503. Let it be remembered that by means of forgotten tunnels, an orc force led by Gorfang Rutgut has attacked and taken the proud hold of Karak Azgal. For the shame and humiliation that the vile horde wrought upon Cadric the king's son, we shall renew our efforts to bring all of our kind to pay for their murderous deeds. 2510. Tidings of the defeat of Warlord Gnashrek at the hands of King Ungrim Ironfist bring but a brief respite in our war against the Greenskins. We shall not rest in our slaying of each and every one of them, and only when the ashes of their bones have been dispersed by the winds shall the grudge be settled.
Dwarves Abroad. The might of the Dwarf Empire rests in the craggy peak of the World's Edge Mountains, where their legends claim that the ancestor gods dug the first hold. However, in the golden days of the dwarf realm, they traveled far and wide, seeking new seams of minerals and gems, and trading with other races. In this time, a number of holds were founded across other parts of the old world. Dwarves from outside the World's Edge Mountains are regarded with a bit of suspicion by dwarves from the older holds. Less respectful of their seniors and tradition, more likely to have truck with other races and tamper with things. Of course, to an outsider there is little difference to discern. although possibly the dwarves of the Grey Mountains, Black Mountains, and further afield may have a slightly more adventurous spirit. The most hardline dwarves of the World's Edge Mountains have various words for these outsiders, such as Wanaz, Badbeards, Zaki, Mad Wanderers, Scrati, Poor Prospectors, and Garazodrak, which roughly translates as distant rebels. For their part, the dwarves outside the ancestral holds, as they are sometimes referred to, have a tendency to call their distant kin Grumbaki, which means grumblers or whiners. Even with this slight animosity, a dwarf would always put another dwarf before a person of another race. Dwarf solidarity runs in the blood, and to the outside world there is not much difference between a dwarf of Karak Hirn and a dwarf of Karak Kadrin. There are also those dwarves whose forefathers wandered even further afield, and settled in more distant or strange lands. To the far north lies Krakadrak, home of the Norse dwarves. So long ago did their ancestors enter the Norscan mountains, that these dwarves have a different language and customs, something which unites all of the other holds together. In many respects, they share traits and traditions with the men of Norska, both in dress, beliefs, and behavior. However, whether this is because they have become more like the Norse, or the Norse have become more like the dwarfs, is a matter of conjecture and speculation. The Norse dwarves are regarded as even madder than other expatriate dwarves by many, and much of this is blamed on their hold's closer proximity to the chaos wastes, and the chaos-worshipping humans of the cold and bleak north. Norse dwarves are famed even amongst other holds for their skill at drinking, holding annual quaffing contests to determine the great ale throats. They also reputedly have a peculiar variant of slayers called berserkers by men, dwarves so grief-stricken and dishonored that they shave off all of their hair, foam at the mouth, and charge into battle determined to hurl themselves into a glorious death on the enemy's weapons. Over the years, many dwarves have also settled in the towns and cities of the Empire and Bretonnia, and even as far as Talea. Here they do not build holds, but instead fortified guild houses can be found, surrounded by a dwarf quarter, where all the dwarves will live. Frequently these houses will have vast cellars and catacombs, so that a small building above ground may well house a considerable clan beneath the surface. Even among such outgoing dwarves, old habits die hard. The services of these dwarves are highly prized as engineers, stonemasons, and mining overseers. It was dwarves who first introduced black powder to the Empire and helped with the founding of the Nuln Gunnery School and the Imperial College of Engineers. Many of these dwarves are considered renegades by the Dwarf Engineers Guild, having been kicked out at a young age for outlandish experiments, or for voicing opinions on matters that did not concern them. Others are the descendants of refugees from the captured holds, lured to human lands by the promise of gold, or unable to face the shame of asking another hold for sanctuary. These dwarves are even more embittered than their kin of the mountains, begrudging the day they were dispossessed, yearning for a chance to reclaim their ancestral lands. The War of Vengeance.
Heed well, stubble-chinned beardlings, while I tell you the tale of the greatest treachery, the most base treason to be inflicted upon us. It was in the reign of Gotrek Starbreaker, 4,500 of years ago, when our empire spread across the world, and even the poorest dwarf had a bag of gold the size of your head. At that time, the peoples of the elf kingdoms,
and the sons of Grungi lived in peace with one another. Trade flowed across the world, and our coffers filled with well-earned elf gold, as the kin of Ulthuan scrambled to own the labors of our magnificent artisans, whose apprenticeship work surpassed that of today's greatest smiths. But then, the capricious and faithless folks of Ulthuan, dishonorable to an elf, were overcome by a greed for our lands and possessions. In an act of betrayal never again equaled, they ambushed our convoys, slew our warriors and maidens, and stole our finely crafted goods. But Gotrek Starbreaker, being a king of whom it said war, wisdom, and age easily upon his brow, stayed his hand, and sent messengers and envoys to the shores of the Elf Isle to parley with the folk of distant Ulthuan. In derision were they greeted, and in dishonor were they ejected. Their beards, long and lustrous and bushy with age, were shorn from their faces, and they were flung from the elf realms with the cackle of cruel elf laughter ringing in their ears. Now it cannot be said that the sons of Grungi are impetuous people, for our anger is likened to the fuse of a cannon that burns slowly. But just as assuredly does a cannon fire when the fuse is full burnt, so too does our anger erupt and roar into life and portend great devastation for our enemies. So, our magnificent armies marched, their hearts burning with thoughts of vengeance upon the troublesome elf folk. Snorri, half-hand son of King Starbreaker, sought out the host of the elfin phoenix Kinng, and in a battle they clashed, solid dwarf steel against the shoddy weapons of Ulthuan. Great was the slaughter. Many kin of Ulthuan regretted their folly that day, but we sons of Grungi paid a high blood price too. Being of noble birth, Snorri deigned to challenge the Elf King, Calador of the Second, to mortal combat for victory. Yet an underhand blow by the vile elf dispatched Snorri, and his army, overcome with woe at this dishonorable deed, scattered from the field of battle. Snorri's cousin Morgrim was incensed by the death of his kin, and led his folk upon Oregor. For 2 days the elf kin avoided him, their cowardice outweighing their pride despite the best taunts and rouses of Morgrim. Finally, the two forces met, the glittering white silver of the elves against the burnished steel and bronze of Morgrim's great army. The air was filled with the arrows of the elf folk, while the bolts of Morgrim's crossbows darkened the skies like a thunderhead. For hours the exchange continued, until both sides had exhausted their ammunition, drawing mighty hammers and axes that burned with runes of vengeance and justice. Morgrim's army marched upon the slender elf folk. Morgrim himself, his grey-bearded veterans round him, pushed into the heart of the elf army, seeking the greatest warrior to face. He found the elf prince Imladrik and the silent but deadly swordmasters. Never before had there been such a clash, the swords of the elf host ringing dully against the finest fashioned armour of Morgrim's kin, whose hammers shed scales and crushed bones with relentless ferocity. Morgrim bested Imladrik, his ancient rune axe cleaving the thin-blooded prince from midriff to neck, and set the silvered host of Ulthuan cowards to flight. And this was when an elf was a proper elf, not the stringy wastrels you'd fight these days. Morgrim, honoured by the title of Eilgedum, the elf doom by his lords, implacably pursued the pallid-skinned weaklings, first raising the elf town of Athel Mariah to its foundations.
then besieging the port citadel of Tor Alessi. High King Gotrek Starbreaker with all the kin of Karaz joined the Ungrim, and between them arrayed a vast army of stout warriors from half a dozen holds. Never since has the world trembled under so many dwarf boots. As the ironclad legion of the Dwarf King assailed the walls of Tor Alessi, the elves quailed in their slender towers and thin-walled minarets. So mighty was the force arrayed against them. For 100 days the rocks of our catapults made the walls and ground shake, punishing the shoddy workmanship of the elf city. King Starbreaker, Morgrim Ilgedum beside him, breached the gates with his hammers, and found his way to the central citadel, where he found the traitorous elf king Calador II. The craven Calador refused to come out and fight like a true warrior, and the High King thus set about the tower with his great hammer, crushing poorly mortared brick and shattering the flimsy foundation until the tower toppled, and Calador was forced to face him. Finally, spurred by his predicament, the Phoenix King of the Elven Isle drew his long-bladed sword, and he and the High King duelled. Long lasted that fight, for although an elf, Calador had been tutored in the ways of battle by the best of Ulthuan's warrior sages. Yet Gotrek was no beardless whelp, and neither could land a blow upon the other. Finally, as night began to draw its veil over the ruined city, sturdy dwarf craftsmanship won over. Calador's sword shattered against Gotrek's hammer, as a flawed elf blade beaten upon a time-worn dwarf anvil. Calador cried for mercy, but the fires of retribution burned in the High King's eye, for he knew that the affront of the elves would never be cowed with leniency. His hammer ended it, and Calador, second Phoenix King of that name, was no more. In recompense, the High King took the dead elf's crown, and here in Karaz it remains to this day. Thus was the grip of the elf claw on our lands broken, and they fled to their home shores weeping for their fallen. We showed them what real dwarf metal was like, and the war of vengeance was our great victory. And yet, never have they apologized for their insults, and still yet, there are unnumbered entries in the great book of Grudges that must be atoned for. Never again, though, will Elfkin make the mistake of rousing the ire of the sons of Grungi. Mark my words. That's how it was.